they're a pretty good tree expert.
Expert?
Okay, now, I want you to know, I did not raise my hand either, okay? What I can tell you, I started out as a geologist, and I thought I knew everything about rocks until I went to college. And then, the more I studied, the less I knew. The more I knew that I didn't know. Well, that's kind of how I feel about horticulture and then arboriculture. Is I thought I knew everything. I was actually walking power lines 20 years ago and identifying vegetation for the utility company. I was not a certified arborist, but I thought I knew a ton about trees, and I actually knew a lot more than most of my colleagues. But I guarantee you, I did not know everything, and I was not an expert. And now it's 20-some years later, I think I know even less. So I was going to say, all the experts, please come up to the front of the room now. You know, how about like advanced intermediate? I know there's at least one in here. There we go. Thank you. I recognize at least a few of you here. I know I'm mentoring a couple of you. Some of you I've seen before. I do often give talks at the fair, which is way more crazy than trying to talk to a whole group of interested master gardeners. My very first talk ever was at the fair, and the beer garden sat right there. In order to get to the beer garden, they had to walk by me giving my tree talk, and then walk by, and they'd be standing there listening to it. So I actually started thinking that the best way I could evaluate if I did a good job talking that day was if there was more people sitting there at the end of my talk than when I started. So, now, you all are forced to be here, so I'm not going to feel bad if you have to use the restroom or you really want to go out on this beautiful day. You know, I'm holding you here, and you know, this wasn't my idea. So, I hope you will, I know you all were given some quick little speedy handouts that I put together. One of them is directed particularly to master gardeners. It is not to make you a tree expert, and it is Urban Trees, 10 key questions and answers you see master gardeners should understand. Now, the reason I put this together is that in the hotline, a lot of you may get questions, or when you're out in your communities, you may get questions similar to what I'm posing here. And a lot of you may go, I don't know much about trees. Well, instead of just calling me up, hey, Robin's the expert, okay? What I want you to do is pull out your handy-dandy sheet and see how much information you can pull from the resident, your friend, yourself, your own observations before you actually ask for somebody who supposedly has more knowledge than you. And what I can tell you is that when someone shows me a mystery tree, usually the obvious stuff is no longer what it is. So I'm no different than the rest of you. I have to start asking all these sleuthy questions, which are kind of directed here about what's wrong with my tree, you know, maybe how can I prune it, how can I do something else. So I want you to understand what that was designed for. The other one is 10 common myths, and on the back of it, which I don't have, is sort of resources. So again, it's a lot of stuff crammed on a couple of pages, but the idea is to help guide you maybe one step more than maybe what the rest of your master gardener is training in terms of honing in specifically on the needs of trees. And I'm passionate about this, partly because I did sort of morph from being just a plant person and a landscape designer and a horticulturalist and a master gardener. This is my 20th year. And I really started realizing that trees weren't just decorations on streets, but they provide this wealth of benefits so we can all breathe, we can eat food, we can have clean water. A lot of these things we take for granted, the natural resources in our environment, are actually provided by trees. So, one of the things I didn't hand out, you don't have to read it now, but I'm going to put, there's a whole thing here called Trees Pay Us Back. I'll just let you take one. If you live in most of San Diego, you take one from the top. If you live in East County, take one from the bottom. Okay? And basically what this is put out by the Forest Service, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and CAL FIRE. And it kind of tells you in a sort of synopsis the value of trees to your community, and it would shock you. All right, so let's look at the first top 10 myths of trees, because then we'll go through quickly what that really is. And by the way, this is not official. You're not going to read this in a book. This is me talking. It's what I think. These are some of the common things that I get asked, or that people assume that I think are really wrong, and I wanted to dispel. So probably most of you've already heard that topping anything is not usually a good idea. It's particularly bad for a tree. But the question is, why is that? Well, I brought a sample of a Brazilian pepper, okay? What I would call probably the all-around bad tree. There are some good places for it. If you have a nuisance space and you want a big screen and you really don't care how big it is, makes good wildlife habitat. It'll take over an entire yard if you let it. But let's say it is growing, and let's say it's as high as that wall right there. And you are sitting in your second-story living room, and now you're looking out, and you can no longer see over that hedge of trees. Okay? So let's just say that's 12 feet, 10 feet over there, and you want to see over 10 feet. So what a lot of people do is they go over with like hedge trimmers or chainsaws, and they cut the tops at 12 feet or 10 feet, whatever it is their view wants to be. Well, if you're a horticulturalist, you know what happens when you prune something, okay? What happens next year? Not only don't you have new growth, but you might have 10 of these new growths right where you wanted to see. So not only are you disfiguring your tree, but you're actually encouraging it to grow exactly where you don't want it. So not only isn't it good for your tree, it's not good for you. In many cases, a tree that's been topped never recovers. Now, there is a sad truth that most of you do not know. And that is, I would hazard a guess that 70 to 90% of all the trees you see planted in the city have been topped. Now, they're often not topped on the street. They were topped in the nursery. That means when you go to the store and buy a tree, there's a very good chance the tree may be topped. So I want you to understand what that means, what to look for, and where to find and ask the right questions, and how to avoid buying top trees. Okay? So, that's a baby tree. And guess what? It's not topped. I pulled it out of the ground this morning, okay? And don't laugh. This is the best way to buy a tree. If you possibly can, in fact, you don't have to buy it. You can just go looking around and you probably can find one, like I did. This happens to be a tipu. Okay, it's just growing on its own. I found it in my yard. My neighbor has a tipu. And I went looking this morning, and sure enough, I found a little baby, and I pulled it out. So we got a little baby with a little root. And if you plant this, by next year, you will have a really, really good-sized plant. And in 3 or 4 years, you will have a good-sized tree. Way bigger than that could fit in one of these pots. But what happens, like, okay, let's look at a real common, what's the city tree of San Diego? Who knows? Yeah, jacaranda. Okay, so here's jacaranda. When jacarandas are big, they look like long pencils. Okay, literally, they just make a stick coming out. It almost looks like a piece of bamboo. So if you didn't know that it would eventually become this gorgeous tree with lots of purple flowers in May and June, you might look and go, I don't want that pencil. I want something that looks kind of tree-like. And so the nurseries, knowing that most people have not heard me talk, people like you, so people go in and they see a pencil and they just keep walking until they see one that's got nice little green stuff on top. Well, how do you make the green stuff grow on top? Well, you clip off the top of the plant, and you will force branching. And so usually in the second year, that sits in a nursery and it's not making any side branches, the nurseries will come in and clip the top of the trees. And then it'll shoot out a whole bunch of branches. And if you look on the back poster, if you're close to that, or you look at your handout on page 5, at the bottom of the page, if you don't learn anything else today, look at those two graphics on the bottom of page 5. The one on the left is a good healthy tree. Actually, they have it, Dawn, so I did reproduce it, I forgot. The one on the right, if you look, all the branching is coming from one central location. And that's what you want to look for. Now, if you go home today and walk up and down your street and look around somewhere between shoulder height and about a foot or two over your head, around eye level generally, you will see tree branches all coming from one place. It's very, very common. It makes trees top heavy. It makes a lot of wound tissue that's unnecessary. And often the trees have compromised roots as well, but we'll get there. So number one, you don't want to top trees. And when it comes into avoiding that problem, okay, this is how I really recommend people to buy trees. Now, a lot of people think I'm crazy. So I will have to say, okay, the next best way would probably be in a 1 gallon. Or sometimes if you go to a tree nursery, you might be lucky, and you might find them in this is called a liner. So this is how you'll often find a tree growing. This is a pretty good way, because let me show you a little sample here. So if this is the tree, this was actually the root, and it actually kept going. I had to clip some of it off. So you got a 1/2 inch caliper diameter tree, and it's got all this root, and I had to cut it off to get it out of the ground. Now if it was in a pot like this, it'd be okay. But where would those roots go if it's in a 1 gallon container? Well, they're going to have to go all the way out the bottom of the container, right? Either that, or they're going to have to go round and round. Now that's okay as long as when you pull it out of the pot, that you can unwind them, okay? It's okay, I'm not hurting you to this day. Okay, so you can unwind it. If you unwind those roots and you can put them laterally, then you can plant it, okay? But if you have all these roots like this and they're going down, in most parts of San Diego, now if you were living in Florida where you have lots of sand, probably okay. But here in San Diego, when most of our soils are not very deep, you really want your roots to go lateral. So the question is, how deep do tree roots grow? Does anybody know? Oh boy, I'm really here. Most people think that a really good tree. Sorry, let me put it. Am I back on?
Yeah.
Okay. Most people think a really good tree has a taproot. And I want to tell you the sad, sad story about taproots. That's number 3. Basically, when a tree is young, it will do this. It will send down that long root. And then as this continues to go down, maybe 3, 4, maybe even 5 feet, it will start to quickly send out side roots to help stabilize the tree. And then what happens to these long roots? There's not enough oxygen in our soil deep down, so these will eventually decay and go away. So the truth is that 90% of all tree roots are in the top 3 feet of the soil. 70% are in the top 18 inches. So the best, healthiest trees you can get, you want to have them somewhere between 2 and 3 feet down. But that's going to stabilize your tree. But it also means the trees need to have them really, really spreading wide. How many people watched the news and saw all the trees falling down in the city over the storms? Okay? I went out personally and looked at many of them. And I have to tell you, now I didn't look at all 500 and something, but every tree that I went to look at that failed, largely because the tree roots either had been cut because somebody thought the sidewalk was more important than the tree, which maybe it is, but do you really want the tree to fall? Personally, I think we should make walkways and trees more compatible, but that's a whole other story and another topic. So essentially, you don't want to plant a tree deep, you want to plant a tree shallow. And you want to plant a tree ideally in a square hole, not a round hole. So why? This surprised me because I used to dig round holes when I was in Girl Scouts. They seem to work okay. So if you're a tree and you're in our soil, and actually this would be a pretty small hole because ideally you want to have a tree that you want to have a hole that's twice as wide, or at least twice as wide, preferably 3 times as wide as the pot. So if this is my sample tree, and by the way, this is a real tree, unfortunately it is also dead. But let me tell you, it's dead because I went to the nursery, I identified it as a bad tree. I told the nursery owner I was going to use it for show and tell as a bad tree, but if he gave it to me, I wouldn't divulge which nursery. And he said, there's nothing wrong with this tree. And I said, well, you can't even pull it out of the ground. I said, the roots are growing right through the pot. So he came over, and right in front of me, he went under there and he clipped all the roots. He says, see, it's fine.
Oh, crap.
And I said, well, actually, I don't think so. And I hadn't taken this tree apart yet. I just saw roots on the surface and roots coming out of the bottom. And by the way, this tree was actually in a 5-gallon container, not a 15. Okay? Now, I know you can't tell from looking at it, but this was a ginkgo. It was actually a grafted ginkgo, so it's a good, well-behaved tree generally. For the most part, it had a nice straight trunk. Okay, it wasn't all kinked, and there was at one time a few more branches coming off on it, so that was actually a good thing. But why did I think it was going to be such a horrible tree? Well, let me tell you what I did. After I bought it, and it dried out a bit, I took all the soil off of it. Literally hosed it down, cleaned it off, and wow. Okay. So now, there you can see the 5-gallon container. But what's worse, if you look this way, you can see the square from the tree liner. Okay, so there's actually, you can see where the tree was grown in this square liner, and the roots coiled around in the square, and then in the nursery, well, they take it out, and then they plunge it into a bigger container, and they cover it up with soil. And the thing is, let me explain this. This is why your city trees are so bad. Because if you don't follow my idea, and you plant a tree like this, all right, well then somebody at the nursery, somebody has to grow it like this, by the way. All trees start from a seed, whether they happen naturally in the environment or somebody does it in a propagation place. So if this doesn't sell, somebody puts it in here or puts it in here, okay? And if it doesn't sell, it gets put into one of these, right? Okay? And if I hadn't have bought this poor guy, well, someday they would have put it out of its misery a different way, and they would have planted it in one of these. And you would have paid more for it. And guess what? The city of San Diego requires that all city trees be at least a 24-inch box to be planted on the street. And in downtown San Diego, the code is a 36-inch box. So, if it doesn't sell in a 15, they lift it up, they put it in a 24, and it goes on. So all of you who think that the best thing you can do if you got a lot of money is buy nice, big, instant box trees, not only are you wasting your money, you're buying, in all likelihood, a very, very sick tree. Yes?
Once the roots have gotten into that configuration where they're all sort of trapped, is there any way when you plant it sort of like free them a bit, or is it gone? at
Okay,
that point?
so what he said is, when it's like this, is there any way to free it after it's like this? My answer is, in this particular example, no. Because you've already got roots that were compromised in the basically 4-inch liner. So the time to have corrected this would have been when it was in this container. It would have been that the root might have been flexible enough, you might have been able to clip some of these. So you can actually, I mean, the catch is you can get a tree and start clipping the roots, spreading them out, pulling them. I've gotten to the point where I've seen so many bad trees that I will not plant a new tree unless I essentially bare root it. And it's not because that's the tree's fault. I mean, one thing that happens here in Southern California that's not the case in the United States is we do grow our trees in containers in our nurseries. And that's largely because our soils are so compacted, and as you probably also know, they're not really organically, rich. They're hard pan. So a nursery, it doesn't make sense for most nurseries to grow trees in the ground. And there actually is a landscape architect who wrote a book called Up by Roots. And in his book, he had done a lot of research, and he came to the conclusion that he would never plant another containerized tree. And this is a landscape architect who usually are not on my side on this. So you probably wondered about this thing front and center. So this is the true confession. This was my tree. I planted this tree. So how did I not know that this was this bad? I'm a certified arborist as well as a veteran master gardener. And this tree had been in the ground about 8 years. And so it's about 10 years old, long after the point of time where I should have known better. So what happened? How did I miss this? Okay, so this was actually in one of those 5-gallon containers, and it's an avocado. Okay, avocados are known to have shallow roots, and you can see just how horrible this is. I mean, really, it's totally coiled. It's hard for even me to imagine that I missed it. But what I can tell you is what I guess is that when it was smaller, that it had lots of nice fibrous roots all over the root ball. And I just assumed, in my ignorance, that all those nice fibrous roots were all fresh and it was a nice healthy root ball. And I probably stretched out a few of them, but I missed essentially what you're asking, which is the part that was inside. And what the really bad part is that when this happens to your tree, in this case this was my avocado, it basically can't use water properly anymore. The roots start pushing at each other and breaking the tissue on the outside of the root, exposing it to disease. The xylem tissue that pulls water up from the soil up to the foliage, it gets compromised. The roots can't do that in some places, and they literally girdle themselves underground. So the only reason I yanked this tree up is that I had several avocados. In fact, I have about 100 fruit trees. And this one was just, I kept throwing water at it, and it just looked sullen, and it tipped a little bit. And finally, it seemed like, it's not worth throwing all this time and money at this tree. And anyway, I got dug up, and I said, oh no. Washed it off, and so I have to now admit that this was my tree. So my warning to all of you, if I know better, I'm highly trained, and I can mess up this badly, and I spent 8 years trying to grow fruit on this tree. And I did grow fruit, by the way. It did grow fruit. It did make fruit. It just started to decline, and it takes about 5 to 10 years for a bad tree specimen to start looking bad. So now we're going to get into one of the other aspects of tree planting. Number 4, amend the soil well when planting a tree. Yes?
Sorry, 2 questions. Do you mind saying the stats that you said for the percentage of trees and their roots? And then another question is, does the city of San Diego have a forester on staff? Okay, no.
Well, a Okay, so the first question is, what were the stats on what?
Percentage of roots in the zone.
Oh, okay. As a rule of thumb, approximately 90% of all tree roots for all species will go down 3 feet. So you will have some that will go a little more, but most tree roots are going to stay in that zone, and they're going to reach as wide as you allow them. And then there's a little irony here, because a lot of people think if it's a really bad location, like just like out in the, nobody's taking care of the tree. Have you ever seen a tree just growing out in like a park that nobody takes care of, and somehow the tree's all green, there's nothing else but a few weeds? I have. And I always think to myself, how does that tree manage? Well, the worse the conditions, the more likely the tree roots are to spread. So if you actually nurture your tree, take good care of it, and provide it water out by where the drip line, so if I spin around, the drip line is where my hands are, if I'm the tree, okay, that's about where you want to water. So when it's a little tree like this, you know, well, you got to water right there in the soil. And the other question was on the city forester. Yes, we've got a city forester hired for the first time since San Diego's existed, as far as I know. There was a city arborist horticulturalist, and there are several who work for the Parks Department and for the city streets division. Unfortunately, there was an urban forestry department. And in 2008, Mayor Murphy was the last tree mayor. And ever since then, we have really had no tree advocacy at the city level for the city of San Diego. Now, I know many of you may live in different cities. They lost their Tree USA status. They really stopped putting any money into budgets. I'm actually the arborist on the Community Forest Advisory Board for the city of San Diego. And we are looking for a horticulturalist to join our board, so I'm going to put a little plug in for that. I hope it could be a master gardener. You don't have to be a tree expert. So we have lobbied the city. I personally lobbied the city for the last decade, and a new urban forester professional with the planning department was hired last July, I believe. And he's excellent. I hope sometime we'll get him to speak to the master gardeners at large. But he's getting his feet wet because he's from New York via Minnesota, so he's still learning about California trees. But yes, we're on our way up. An urban forestry management plan has been, well, we actually put together one for the city of San Diego in the last 2 years, and it's going through the slogging process. I could have another whole hat for politics, but we're not going to do that today either. So anyway, so if you're going to plant this tree in the soil, and you want those tree roots to go, again, hi people who planted tomatoes. Yeah, good, okay, see my hand was up too. So when you plant a tomato, you dig a nice deep hole, you get the best compost you can, and what do you do with the for me, if it's my tomato, well, I don't have a tomato with me, but make believe this is a tomato, okay, and if it's in a pot, you can actually take the tomato, in fact you should, and bury even a lot of the leaves, right? Because they will actually make new root tissue, and you'll actually start out with a much better root system, and the top part, because they're basically an annual, will grow crazy over the course of the season. But if it's a tree, you don't want to do that. And you don't want to dig that deep hole. You don't want to plant the tree deep, and you don't want to use any compost. Now, I know that is the big stretch for most master gardeners. It was a stretch for me for a long time. I was also the manager of the Community Shade Tree Program. And one of the things we had the hardest time convincing the public who got our free trees was to not put trees in real fancy planting holes. Okay? And so the goal is to dig a square hole, and I started telling you about why. But imagine you're a root and you're a tree, and now you're growing in a square hole. Well, I should have put a hole in there, but if you're a root and you're in, first of all, if you're in the round hole, and you hit the side of a hard pan hole, basically a lot of the time, if your shovel has created like in a clay hole, you know, your root is not going to want to go out. It's going to want to go round and round. So that's the first problem we have is that tree roots naturally don't want to do what you tell them. And the best way to avoid it is to have a tree hole that has corners. And so that way when the root goes and it hits a wall, it will turn, but then it'll hit a corner. And it's a lot easier to go through the corner than to make a right angle turn. Okay? So actually the tree roots will go for the corners of your holes. And you don't have to measure. It could be a triangle. It could be, the cool thing is just to make it as wide as you can possibly dig. But only as deep as where the, so if I was planting this tree, and it actually was good, you know, the soil, the hole would only be from here to the bottom, so like a 10-inch hole, 9-inch hole, that's it. But you want to make it like 3 feet wide. Now, the amendment, let me ask you this. This is the trick question. Okay, I'm being told we got to rush.
No, I actually had a question. Could you speak about putting a saucer or a berm around the planting hole? How long should we do that? And if so, how long that might last?
Well, that's for watering. We may or may not get to watering, but we'll try. You'll just have an excuse to call me back for a regular class. So, in the planting hole, let's just say you plant your tree and you dig this nice hole and you put in all this nice compost and amendment, but you have 2 of those trees. And you're doing this experiment and you put the other one the way I tell you. You got this horrible soil, you know, rocks and clay, and it's just awful, and it's hard pan clods, you know, and you think, well, okay, I'm going to do what she says. Now, in 6 months to a year, which tree looks better?
The hard pan native soil.
How about 2 years?
Native soil.
No. So this is the catch. You have to have faith. You are trying to grow a tree, not for 1 year, not for 2 years. You are trying to grow a tree for a minimum, absolute minimum of 25 years. And that would be a short-lived fruit tree. Most big urban trees should live 50 to 150 years. Easy. And we have definitely trees here in the park who expect, we really hope that some of them could live 1,000 years. So you should be thinking about this long-term life of a tree, unlike the tomato that's going to grow and give you fruit and bounty and you're going to pull out of the ground in a year. So the catch is, no matter how bad your soil, you have to put the tree in there and say, get used to it. Because that's, and what you will find is that the tree that gets in that nice nurturing soil initially will look better. It will grow, it'll have all that compost, it'll be happy. But when those roots hit the side, where are they going to go? They're going to say, ooh, I don't like that stuff you gave me out there. I'm going to stay in this nice, so pretty soon you've created essentially like a pot inside the soil. And this is what happens, I hate to tell you, in most of your city trees. So if you saw city trees falling near you, I almost guarantee you that several things happened, and one of them was that they either had, in most cases, compromised roots. I've seen city trees where they have a 3-foot, 36-inch box tree pushed into a 36-inch hole, and then they pull the wooden slats out. So maybe they don't put it, and then they may throw a little fertilizer in the bottom. That's a no-no as well. Same idea. You don't want the tree to do anything bad when it's young. And again, this is why this is such a good idea. Yes?
Could you mix some amendment in, or should you mix none in?
Well, see, anytime I give anybody a little edge and I say, under this little circumstance, you can do, you know, then it gets into this mentality just like Raid. You know, you don't, it's okay to use a
I didn't
little
mean
bit,
it, I
but
take it back.
yes, there are some circumstances where if you have total GG with no humus whatsoever, you know, or you, let's say you're going to plant trees in a spot the size of this room and you actually amend the whole location. Okay, so if you amend a location big enough for the tree to mature, that's one way to accomplish that, and that's a good way. Another way is to amend just a tiny little bit, but again, you know, I don't think it's, personally, I find that there's no evidence that's gonna really help. That's really what it comes down to. So I know I have to kind of wrap up because I'm being given, what time is it? I know we're all anxious to go outside and play. Oh yeah, it's time. Okay, well how about a couple of questions because we don't have time to go through all of this. Yeah, I could talk for 3 hours here, couldn't I? So, no questions, or I'll do one more, yes?
If you say don't chop the tree, how do you keep a tree short?
Okay, so that gets into tree selection, and that is that's one of your, question number, the question here on pruning. 4. Question number 4. I'm glad you asked. So, tree selection, both in the nursery and in your yard, is probably the most critical thing you do. So, if there's a tree that you like, and let's say it gets to 40 feet tall and 40 feet wide. Beautiful tree, let's say like maybe a Chinese elm. We'll see one today. But you only have 20 feet. But you say, well, I'll just keep it pruned. Bad idea, really bad idea. When you've heard the adage, right tree, right place. That's what it's addressing. So trees, this is another question here, because I get calls once a week at least, my tree's getting too tall. I said, do you have any kids? They kind of, you know, what? And, you know, do your kids get too tall? I mean, trees grow as they are genetically programmed to grow. So they do not get too tall. They're going exactly how they're supposed to be. And once we go in there and cut the top off, you're cutting off the meristematic tissue, which at the cellular level is what makes a tree want to grow erect. And forever and ever, it's never going to be the same. Now, are there proper ways to reduce the crown if necessary? Yes. But they are expensive, they're still not good for the tree, and you have to keep doing it over and over and over. And you do not just take a chainsaw and go across the top. You can selectively over a number of years do what's called dropping the crown. You can thin a tree, but you never lace a tree. Those of you who think lacing is acceptable, it is not an acceptable arboriculture term. You've heard it here. So when someone says they want their tree laced, you tell them, no, that is not a proper thing to do to a tree. Yes?
What's the difference between lacing and thinning?
Well, lacing typically, and again, since it's not a legitimate term, it's hard for me to define it, but I know what it looks like. Okay, it's kind of like, well, we won't even go there.
Like the 25 feet. The 25
Yeah. No, I was thinking of the Supreme Court case when they said they didn't know what obscenity was, but they could sure tell when they felt it. You know? Something like that. Anyhow, all I can tell you about is that lacing usually means taking the entire inside of the tree foliage away and leaving tips of foliage on the outside branches. Now, you can reduce the foliage and you can thin out branches, and we'll finish my little thing right now, and we'll see some things outside. But there's only 4 reasons to prune a mature tree. In fact, really 4 reasons to prune any tree. And it's real simple to remember, 4 Ds. Dead, you can always prune dead limbs. Damaged, so if something gets broken because a car went by and hit the branch. Okay, you prune the damaged wood. Diseased or decayed, you can use the same word, or 2 words for that one. And deformed. Now deformed gets into branches that are crossing. There may be architectural reasons to prune a tree, but that's not the reason. You don't do that for the tree, you do that for you. So you may have a rule that your city says that trees have to be 6 feet off the sidewalk so somebody can walk underneath. The tree doesn't need that, but you may have to do that, okay? So you do that, but know that you're not doing that, you're not pruning your tree, you're not helping your tree, you're helping the sidewalk. Okay, so just always remember that. Sometimes it's 14 feet, so an emergency vehicle can get through. Maybe there's a fire hazard, you need clearance on your roof. There's lots of reasons that you do prune trees because somebody wasn't smart enough to plant the tree in the right place in the first case. But in general, there's no, and then keep in mind, I know people who think that every year a tree needs a haircut. I gotta call the tree pruner. That's a waste of money most of the time. Now, I'm not saying that once trees get in bad shape, you may have to do that. But if you have a healthy tree that hasn't been wrecked and hasn't been hacked by bad pruning, every 5 to 10 years should be enough to have somebody come, clean it up, take out those 4Ds, and then it should be good to go for quite a bit more time.